Is it possible that one of the reasons why certain women are attracted to bad boys is because they score high themselves in morbid curiosity?
I would say that that's never going to be the sole factor, but probably in every case, that is a factor of why.
Wow. Today we have Dr. Coltan Scrivner on the show. Dr. Scrivner is a leading expert on the science of horror, true crime, and morbid curiosity. Boy, was this a fun chat. I must admit, I score pretty high in all forms of curiosity, including morbid curiosity, so I had so many questions for him about his groundbreaking research. Dr. Scrivner defines morbid curiosity as an interest in or curiosity about unpleasant things, especially death. In this episode, we take a deep dive into the various studies that have been conducted on this topic so far. Did you know that the average person possesses at least some degree of morbid curiosity? However, some people are much more interested in horror movies, horror stories, and true crime documentaries. What are these people like? The results may surprise you. As Dr. Scrivner puts it in the title of one of his papers, there exists, quote, bleeding heart horror fans. Maybe you will identify as one. Regardless of whether you score high in morbid curiosity, I think you'll find this episode fascinating, as I did. So let's get into it. I bring you Dr. Coltan Scrivner. Dr. Coltan Scrivner, so nice to have you on the Psychology Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I've been wanting to talk to you for a while about your very unique and groundbreaking research within the field of psychology. I want to start off just by asking if you could just introduce yourself to my audience a little bit in your own path, research path, and like what do you study? What were you interested in? What was your own curiosity as a child? Like start there and then just like path. Tell me everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the most common questions I get is, are you a horror fan or have you liked horror since you were a kid? Because the topics I study, right? I didn't dream of growing up to be a psychologist who studies horror by any stretch of the imagination. But I did like scary things as a kid, and I enjoyed playing scary games and watching scary movies. I never really put much thought into it. I think a lot of people don't. And when I got to college, I have a very sort of interdisciplinary background. So I studied biology and cultural anthropology in college, and I was very interested in stress and why and how people got stressed out. Robert Sapolsky was a huge influence on me as an undergraduate, and I was, I loved his sort of unique approach to studying stress. And then I went on and I did a master's in forensic science, and then my PhD is in behavior biology. And so I kind of span the spectrum from sort of cultural anthropology through psychology and sort of more biology or evolution approaches to human behavior. And in graduate school, I was interested in a lot of things. I was still interested in stress. In fact, I was in a hormone lab that mostly studied stress in humans. And I got interested in why people are interested in watching or being a part of violent events. So events that are stressful for most people. So things like UFC or boxing, or, why did the Romans build the Colosseum and why was that successful? Because everywhere I looked, I kept seeing examples of violent entertainment popping up across cultures, across history. And so I was really intrigued by this because usually we would say that violence is immoral and it should never happen, except for in very special cases in which case it's entertainment. And so I started looking into that. And then I had a side interest in why people were scaring themselves for fun for some of the same reasons. And over time, those kind of just morphed into this conglomerate of why people enjoy things that are sometimes dangerous or threatening or scary.
Well, what do you think genetically within you could have predicted this? Are you high in sensation seeking? And we're going to get to all your correlates of your research. But what do you think? I'm starting with you personally.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm actually not that high in sensation seeking. It's been a long time since I've taken one of the sensation seeking scales, but I score above average, but nothing too far in the right tail. But what's interesting is actually a lot of morbidly curious people don't score incredibly high in sensation seeking. They do tend to be kind of in that average to slightly above average range. But yeah, what would have predicted that? I think, I mean, I'm pretty high in openness and curiosity and, so things that are frightening or maybe a bit taboo also interest me. And then that combined with a little bit of sensation seeking, I think probably is a good recipe for someone to do what I do.
Very cool. Well, let's start with one of the landmark papers. Let's start with the landmark paper, not one of the. Let's start with the landmark, 1986.
Mm-hmm.
Zuckerman and Little. Marvin Zuckerman, who is a legend in the field of psychology and the study of sensation seeking. And no offense, I don't know who Patrick Little is. Sorry. Maybe he's grad students. No offense, Patrick Little, if you're listening to this
if you co-author a paper with Zuckerman, I mean, you're going to be the second mention, you know.
Yeah. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying? I'm like, and Patrick, I don't know. But anyway, 1986, all due respect to Patrick Little, they wrote this paper, Personality and Curiosity About Morbid and Sexual Events. That was one paper. Mm-hmm. And they in the same year, they wrote a paper called Curiosity About Morbid Events, the Kame Scale, Enjoyment in Watching Violence and Death. These are two papers that came out in the same year. So they created the scale, and then they also focusing on violence, and then I think the other paper must have come later. I'm just assuming.
Yeah, I think it was after.
Even though it was published in the same year, I assume the way they conducted the research,
right.
They created the scale, then they had branched out to the sexual domain to look at correlations between interest in violence and interest in pornography. Mm-hmm. So let's start off with the seminal paper, 1986, that created the scale. Tell me about the Kame scale.
That was obviously the first thing that I came across when I started looking into this, right? Kind of as you do as a scientist, you get this idea and you get really interested in it. And the first thing you have to do is go, okay, wait, has anyone else had this idea? And if they have they published on it, right? In my case, there wasn't much research on morbid curiosity. There was this sort of, like you said, groundbreaking or pioneering paper on it. And I obviously devoured the paper because I was very interested in what they came up with. And it's a great paper. It unfortunately the scale hasn't been used that much since then. So, when you create this very well, when you create a scientific scale, you kind of do a lot of validation studies and you run it on different populations if you can, use it to test different questions that are sort of adjacent to that. And for some reason, people didn't really pick up the scale afterwards. And so I was going to use it, but as I started looking into it, it seemed a bit narrow to me. Like it only tapped into maybe one side of the dangerous things that people are curious about. So this one focused, especially, the violence side of it, focused on violence, right? And it was really about, and with scales, it really matters how you word things too. There's a difference in saying I am interested in violence and I am interested in watching violence. Those are maybe different things, right? And they're going to predict different things. How you respond to that might predict different things. And so, I thought, the fact that nobody had really picked up this scale and done a bunch of studies with it, and that I had my own sort of maybe issues with conceptually what it was tapping into, I decided to go ahead and make my own scale because it was, at the time it was 40 years old as well. And so research has advanced quite a bit since then. And so it just seemed like it was time to maybe do a new scale for morbid curiosity.
I definitely want to get to all the new stuff, and that's going to be the main focus of the rest of the interview. But I'm stuck on this 1986 paper because I actually really like it.
Yeah. Tell me about what do you like about it?
Well, I liked it because they link it to increase in peripheral catecholamines.
In the second paper? Is that the second one? Yeah.
I actually like the second paper better than the first paper. Yeah. I found the first paper a little boring, to be honest. But I really like the second paper. It's very, very interesting to me, this positive correlation between interest in violence, interest in like pornography, for instance, because nowadays there's a huge proliferation in violent pornography. So the combination of the two, right? And that's very controversial. That's very controversial, right? Like, but at the same time, it's getting millions and millions of views. These things. So we're not talking about like, are we allowed to be honest about that? There seems to be a desire for it that's very, very large in the population for consuming fantasy about it. And obviously at the same time, we want to really condemn it in reality, if it's non-consensual.
Right.
Okay. So how do we hold both of these things at the same time as a segue into your work, which the spirit of your work really right there, you say in the beginning of your whole paper, your seminal 2001 paper, you open up and say, we're morbidly curious as a species.
Yeah.
So do you see how I'm linking these things together? Like, let's have a really open, honest conversation about like the appeal of a lot of these things,
Yeah.
and then talk about the morality of it later.
Yeah.
Let's first talk about the human nature.
Yeah, I think that's something that gets missed and this too in psych research in general, because we're talking about people. We want to go straight to morality first, and like, should we study this or not study it? And I think I'm personally of the opinion that we should know what we're dealing with first, and then we can decide what we want to do with it. But I think it's important to know, what's influencing our behavior and what's influencing our decisions, and then we can decide if we want to, allow that or change that or modify it in some way.
Correct. And I definitely do want to have the morality discussion, but let's review all the facts first. Yeah. So walk me through this 2001 paper, which just seems like a really nice sequel to the original 86 studies and in huge extension, because, they really were groundbreaking, correlating things that a lot of researchers have never correlated with each other, and then linking it to a specific biological system.
Yeah.
That's what I really like about that second paper. So now enter Dr. Coltan Scrivner. Tell me about your 2001 paper and why, how your methodology.
Yeah, sure. So it's 2021, not 2001. I would have been pretty young in 2001.
Oh, I meant 2021. Yeah,
it's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
of course. During
it would have been much
era.
more impressive if I did that in 2001. But yeah.
Well, you absolutely 2021. It's important to note this. You did it during the COVID era.
Yeah.
And you had some really cool studies around the same time linking it to COVID related things. You have two papers in particular, and so we'll get into that.
Yeah.
Okay, go.
Yeah, so
walk me through
this 2021 paper. Yeah, in 2020, I did a lot of the studies for this 2021 paper between 2020 and 2021. So as right during COVID, it was basically like I mentioned, I had some issues conceptually with the idea that morbid curiosity was only about liking violence. That seemed a little too narrow to me. And so, the first thing I did is I put together a bunch of essentially statements about that I thought tapped into what seemed like morbid curiosity and interest in threats. That seemed much more tangible to me, right? There's, humans have this, not just a negativity bias where things that are negative or bad tend to, come to the fore for us and gather our attention more strongly. But things in particular that are threatening tend to do that, even more so than things that are just broadly negative. And so to me, it seemed like morbid curiosity might be rooted in that. It's really about things that are threatening and paying attention to those and learning about those things. And so that's kind of how I started off conceptually with the topic. And then I thought, okay, what are some things that are conceptually threatening to humans, right? And violence certainly is one of those, but so are understanding the intentions of dangerous people, not just the act of violence, but actually the intentions of the people who are doing it. And another thing are injuries, whether that's an accident or it's caused by something external, but knowing how to deal with injuries is certainly one. And even though it sounds weird, the paranormal, obviously, I couldn't leave out, because for everyone who, would ever say that they're morbidly curious, most of them are going to say they love a good ghost story, right? And so there's something about that seemed like it was tapping into morbid curiosity as well. And so I put together this long list of items, did, factor analysis. I ran them on a bunch of people, did factor analysis, kind of saw how these items clustered together and how they related to one another. And what I found was that there seemed to be, at least with the items that I had, four sort of clustering or four groups of things that loaded onto this one factor. And those four clusterings were an interest in violence, an interest in the minds of dangerous people, an interest in supernatural or paranormal phenomenon, and an interest in bodily injuries or body violations. And all of those things kind of mapped onto this one trait, which I called morbid curiosity. The next thing you do after that is you run a validation. You confirm the factor analysis that those are the groups. And so I did that. And then I ran a bunch of studies showing how these traits linked to other personality traits, how they linked to behaviors, how they linked to different interests. And that's kind of what I've been doing the past couple of years.
That's wonderful. I want to walk our listeners through the finer details of these
Sure.
findings. So first, with the factor analysis and the four factors you found, let's make this concrete. So I'm going to give an example item from each of the four types of four factors. So
Mm-hmm.
this first one's an example of violence. If I lived in medieval Europe, I would be interested in attending a public execution. Okay. Here's an example of body violation. If a head transplant was possible, I would want to watch the procedure. The third factor, motives of dangerous people. Here's an example. I am curious about crime and enjoy reading detailed news accounts about murders and other violent crimes. And then paranormal danger. Here's an example from paranormal danger. I think the supernatural is an interesting topic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Here's something I find really that is interesting. It struck me about the body violation one. I had a bit of an aha moment.
Yeah.
You know, I've gone really being a morbidly curious human such as myself. I've studied a lot of these serial killers and their early childhood development, trying to look for the signs that to try to understand it. And the only thing that stands out about Jeffrey Dahmer and his early childhood, the only thing is his intense curiosity
Mm-hmm.
of the human anatomy and
Mm-hmm.
what people would look like on the inside. That's it.
Yeah.
And as well as animals.
Yeah. And he even said, I think, during his confession that it was one of the bodies that he'd buried under, I think it was a family member's house. I can't remember the exact details. Maybe you know, but anyways, he buried this individual under the house. And when he was asked about it, he went back and actually checked on the body after he had buried it. And he was asked, why did you do that? And he said, morbid curiosity. And he kind of used the phrase, in a non-academic sense, but in a colloquial sort of understanding of I went back because I was morbidly curious. And I think, at another point he said, I'm paraphrasing, but all these people watch these horror movies. The only difference with me is I do it in real life.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
I didn't know he had that quote. I thought I had a great insight, but he just admitted it. He admitted it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's right. And that is a key difference though, between, I think, this normal, typical morbid curiosity and, morbid curiosity when it's fueled by psychopathy and a lack of empathy and all those other traits that form that.
Right. I think that's a greater nuance actually than his quote. It's not like just the only difference. It's like people like let's.
That's it. I just do it in real life. Yeah, I just
no, it's not. He's still not getting it. You know what I mean? Do you know what I mean?
I do.
Saying that just shows what severe lack of empathy he has, but he doesn't get it because he doesn't know what it's like to have the chip that most humans have.
Yeah.
I know that I could nerd out with you on this at a very, very deep level. So let's just jump into the deep end.
Sure. Yeah.
So yes, a lot of people do have a morbid curiosity. There are individual differences.
Mm-hmm.
You have found that these four factors are correlated with each other with the average intercorrelation about 0.38 or so.
Mm-hmm.
So it's moderate, but these can break apart in various ways. It's possible Jeffrey Dahmer was maybe not as high in some others,
Correct.
Supernatural. I don't know. Maybe he really stood out on the second one, or maybe the first one as well, the violence one. But if you look at the correlations of this trait that do vary in the general population, one thing I want to point out is that the research that has replicated on this has shown quite clearly that there is really no correlation between this scale and empathy and compassion.
Yeah.
One way or the other. Now that would be truly fascinating if there was a positive correlation with that.
There is in some cases actually with subscales of empathy. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So we can talk about empathy if you want, or we can keep on this. Where do you want to take this?
Well, because of the Jeffrey Dahmer thing and why I don't think he got it. I don't think he got it. I would like to double click on that. Yes, I would like to double click on empathy, compassion thing, because I do think that most people, I think it's really important to distinguish an interest in morbid curiosity from serial killers.
Yeah.
I want to really, particularly someone who scores very high in morbid curiosity and compassion.
Right. right?
You know,
You're
I
you're
want
a
I
dark
want
empath. You're a dark empath. We'll talk about that later,
no.
I'm sure.
Oh, I don't know if I would. I don't know if I would identify as a dark
Maybe
empath
not
because dark empaths, that's correlated with the dark
with the
triad.
dark triad. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't really think I score high in the dark triad. I think I just score high in morbid curiosity. I think I
Yeah.
score high in morbid curiosity and the light triad.
That would actually be a bit unusual. We should talk about. We'll talk about that. I'm sure,
Okay,
but I would love to chat about that. But yeah, okay. So empathy and compassion. That's some of the more recent studies I've done have been on that because, in the 80s there was kind of a bit of a panic about horror movies because horror movies were now being put on VHS and coming into the home, and there was this huge panic about like we're having all of these awful violent movies in the home, and of course scientists tend to reflect some of those concerns that people have, and so there were studies in the 80s about empathy in horror movies, and if you want, we can talk about those afterwards and some issues I have with them. But basically, there hadn't been many studies on, or any really, on morbid curiosity and empathy or compassion. And so one of the recent studies I did looked at whether or not people who are morbidly curious, who are horror fans, do they have lower or higher levels of cognitive empathy or affective empathy? So the ability to kind of take someone's perspective, or the ability to sort of feel what other people feel. And do they have higher or lower levels of compassion? And for the compassion measure I used, you're familiar with the PPI, right? The Psychopathic Personality Inventory. I think it's Lilienfeld's.
Yes. Although I would have some qualms that some of those facets really are indicators of psychopathy, such as rebelliousness.
Yeah. So
how do you say it?
Rebelliousness. Yeah. I kind of agree with you, but he has a measure on there. One of the facets. Yeah. I only used one facet. I just used the cold-heartedness facet.
Oh, got it. Well, that's a good one. Okay, yeah. that one I like.
So that
I don't
one,
like it, but it's related to psychopathy. Yeah.
Exactly, and that one really taps into like, if you're high in cold-heartedness, you tend to just not care about other people, right? You just have no care for them.
You found a small negative correlation between morbid curiosity.
Correct. Yeah. So that's what I was saying. There's actually, for compassion and for cognitive empathy, actually, there's a slight positive correlation. I think for some of the facets, I can't remember exactly which ones. I think it was perspective taking and online simulation or something like that. There was a small positive. It would need to be replicated to see if it was truly interesting. But yeah, basically across the board, no matter how I looked at it, whether I asked people, rate yourself, how much of a horror fan are you? Or if I asked them, how many of these top 50 horror movies have you seen? And I counted them up, or, no matter how I measured it, I kept finding that there was basically no correlation between empathy and compassion and being morbidly curious and being a horror fan. And if there was a correlation, it was small and positive with higher levels of empathy or compassion.
So given that finding, why, when I said I score high in light triad as well as morbid curiosity, were you like, oh, well, that would kind of go against the grain, as opposed to, based on what you just said, it would be like, oh, that makes sense considering it's a neutral sort of relationship.
Correct.
So I'm curious why you made that comment when I said what I said.
Because in all the other studies I've done as well, morbidly curious people score a little bit higher in the dark triad.
In Machiavellianism.
No, in all three usually. It is. If you get a big enough sample, some of them go away. I think like narcissism kind of dwindles down to be mostly non-significant. It's like very small if it's positive, and I think psychopathy and Machiavellianism, though, stay positive in all the ones I've done. What's interesting is that, for example, when I've used the PPI, it measures. I can't recall all the facets, but it's got 6 or 7 different factors associated with it. And morbidly curious people score higher in all of those facets except cold-heartedness. So they score high in all these other things related to psychopathy, but with cold-heartedness, they actually score lower, and consistently lower. It's not high. It's a small correlation, but it is a consistent negative correlation with cold-heartedness. That's actually what got me into the empathy research in the first place. Is I was really intrigued by this finding that these people are essentially somewhat dark triad people, but they score really low, lower than average on this one trait that people tend to associate with psychopathy, this cold-heartedness trait.
What do you think's going on there?
Man, I wish I knew, because that's fascinating, right? I mean, I
am so fascinated by that finding right now.
And I go back to that paper, at least. So after I published, that's in that 2021 paper, that first time I found that, I went back to that paper at least 4 times and reran the data, because I was like, I know that I reverse coded something and did it wrong. Like I went back and just neurotically checked it. I'm a very non-neurotic person, very low in neuroticism. And that was the one thing that just like plagued me. I would go back and check it because it didn't make any sense. Um, you know, maybe we can chat about this towards the end, but I actually think we have psychopathy I think subclinical psychopathy is pretty misunderstood. And it does not track straight into clinical psychopathy like we conceptualize it. But
I bet we can figure this puzzle out together.
Yeah,
I feel like you bring both of our minds together and our research background.
I know, and I'm telling you, I just that finding like both intrigued me and haunted me because I was like, "There's no way this is right."
So if it turns out that at the highest level of the hierarchy, well, the highest level you're gonna have a general factor, but right under that, if you have a 2-factor model of the scale. It says the cold-heartedness subscale typically does not load onto either factor.
Oh, of the PPI, yeah. Yes. So there are a lot of issues with the PPI where, like, researchers, when they use the PPI to study psychopathy, they will just drop the cold-heartedness, which I think is kind of a problem because to me that actually taps into clinical psychopathy.
That's exactly. Well, I think the mystery of this puzzle is connected to that fact that cold-heartedness is kind of an odd man out on these other factors. So one factor is fearless dominance, self-centered impulsivity. Mm-hmm. Those are the 2 factors: fearless dominance, and self-centered impulsivity. I agree with you that it feels like cold-heartedness is really psychopathy.
Well, it's certainly antisocial personality disorder, right? I mean, that's kind of the defining feature of. There's not really like you don't get diagnosed as a psychopath, you get diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and cold-heartedness is kind of the core of that, to my knowledge. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but my understanding is that's kind of the core of it. But, that would mean to me, again, that subclinical psychopathy, right? So there's clinical, which, you get, which is a bit different, but subclinical psychopathy, I think is a bit misunderstood. And I think people use it as kind of a proxy for clinical psychology, clinical psychopathy, when it might in fact be something a bit different. The origins of subclinical psychopathy, I think, are probably different. The biological substrates are probably different than clinical psychopathy for that reason, right?
I mean, this is you're really hitting on something that I think is important, and we're still trying to make sense of what it means. But let's talk about this study that is very recent called "Bleeding Heart Horror Fans." Mm-hmm. Enjoyment of horror media is not related to lower empathy or compassion. So they found enjoyment of horror movies was unrelated to affective empathy, mm-hmm. which we call, just that's what most people think of when they think empathy.
Right.
They think that you feel the emotions of others.
Feeling what others feel.
Yes. Yeah. Negatively associated with cold-heartedness. There it is again. Replicated and positively associated with cognitive empathy.
Right. So like perspective taking, or which kind of makes sense for a horror fan, right? If you are watching a scary movie, what makes that movie scary, right? The thing that makes it scary is that you are taking the perspective of the protagonist and imagining yourself in their shoes and being afraid sort of in their shoes. So if you can't take their perspective or you're not good at it, you're not going to enjoy scary movies or other kinds of scary play, right? Because you can't actually take the perspective in order to enjoy it. So that finding actually makes sense to me, that you would be a bit higher in perspective taking.
Do you know if serial killers enjoy watching horror movies?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Do real life monsters enjoy watching horror?
Do monsters enjoy monsters? Yeah.
Yeah.
So Dahmer had a weird obsession with a very obscure horror movie. So The Exorcist 3, which was not.
That's right.
You remember he would like make his victims watch it, and he loved it and would watch it over and over again. But that was more of like a specific obsession than like he didn't have Halloween posters up on his wall. He just was like really obsessed with this one movie.
He did that to get in character, he said.
Yeah.
He had to do that to get into an altered state of consciousness in order to do what he had to do, or else he would have guilt.
Yeah. He had a lot of other things going on than just his morbid curiosity. He had a lot more. He had a lot more going on than just that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we really need to make that point very clear in this episode today.
Yeah, I mean that's how right now, like, so I'm working on a book, and the last chapter just starts with that story and just tries to use that to like flip the script a little bit. So there's this picture that we're painting here that people can score high in morbid curiosity, and it just seems to be related more to
behavioral activation
Yeah, I would say
as
so.
well. Well, this was interesting. It seems like both, and behavioral avoidance. Like I think neurotic people, neuroticism.
Hmm.
Neuroticism is going to predict the extent to which you're morbidly curious, so that you can try to learn about the world and avoid danger and threats in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the findings that I usually find, it kind of depends on the sample, but typically there is a small positive correlation between measures of anxiety and measures of morbid curiosity. Neuroticism is a bit more mixed because neuroticism, I think, it's a little bit broader and like conceptually in what it captures. But anxiety does, so trait anxiety and state anxiety both to some extent track with morbid curiosity. It's small, but it's positive and consistent. I find it over and over again, and you find it in related studies, like things about adjacent topics that sort of are corroborating evidence for that. For the same reasons you say, right? If you're anxious, what are you? Well, you're more vigilant towards threats in your environment. If you're morbidly curious, what are you? Well, you're kind of interested in learning about threats in your environment, right? So those two kind of promote each other, which creates this really funny situation where you have, a lot of people have a perception of, let's say, like a horror fan or a morbidly curious person of being this like sort of psychopath who's not afraid of anything. And in reality, a lot of morbidly curious people are a bit anxious and not psychopathic, or at least not cold-hearted, not low in empathy, right? So that you get this weird situation where they really defy kind of the stereotype that a lot of people have about morbidly curious people.
Yeah. Have they conducted the study yet on the morbid curiosity scale and interest in BDSM?
No, but I imagine those would be positively correlated. I would be shocked if they weren't.
I would be shocked if they weren't.
For the same reason, right? For the same reason.
Right, that's right. Well, that's right. And the studies, some interesting studies I've seen, and the reason why I bring this up is because I've seen that a very high percentage of people interested in BDSM do score high in neuroticism.
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean, that's essentially what you're doing, right? You're kind of role playing a dangerous situation, and in many cases, which is, I mean, just nail on the head exactly what morbid curiosity is for.
So interesting. This is also interesting. I want to keep going through these papers. There's a really good body of research on this topic. First of all, I want to say congratulations to you. Really going into this field, studying a topic that is not well studied, and really charting a path on this, which has now produced a number of really high quality studies on it. So really, congratulations.
Thank you.
Let's go through. Let's talk about a really recent paper, which is going to relate to a solo episode I'm doing later on new Do Nice Guys Finish Last? Is an episode I'm recording later for my podcast.
Yeah.
But this paper, I'm going to definitely talk about this paper. Behavioral attraction predicts morbidly curious women's mating interest in men with dark personalities. I mean, that's a mouthful, that whole title.
That was a change in the revisions to make it clear what the paper was about. It initially had a shorter title, I think, but there was a change during the revisions where we tried to make the title more specific to the finding.
I mean, couldn't you say why women like bad boys? I mean, why do you have to be like behavioral attraction?
Yeah. Initially, it was something more like that.
I get it. But let's talk about this study. So, why is it possible that one of the reasons why certain women are attracted to bad boys is because they score high themselves in morbid curiosity?
I would say that's never going to be the sole factor, but probably in every case, that is a factor of why.
Wow.
Yeah. Same thing with serial killers, right? Are serial killers morbidly curious? Yeah, probably most of them or all of them would score above average. But is that why they're a serial killer? No, right?
And we've been wanting to make that point clear from the beginning, over and over.
Yeah. And I think it's actually a bit, with interest in the bad boy, or interest in this case, it was like dark triad men, right? I think that morbid curiosity probably plays a much stronger role in that than it would being a serial killer, right? Like as far as the behavior of it, right? The behavior of going out and short-term mating with dark triad men probably morbid curiosity, I would say influences that more than being a serial killer. Because there's just so many other factors that are involved with, pushing you over the edge of killing someone versus pushing you over the edge of going on a couple of dates with a guy who seemed like a jerk.
Oh, definitely. But I'm double clicking on is the attraction to them.
Yeah.
let's put the serial killer stuff to the side for a moment.
Yeah.
And just focus on the attraction to bad boys. You can be a
Yeah.
bad boy, not be a serial killer. So
Yes.
I'm talking about just dark people who have manipulative,
Right.
men who are liars, cheats.
Right.
They're manipulative and narcissistic. Why would that be attractive?
Yeah.
So one of the reasons this research shows is morbid curiosity.
Yeah, which, especially in modern sort of dating situations, it's easier, I think, to short-term date someone and then ghost them or not have them be in your life in 2024 than it was in 1924, right? It's much easier to go on a few dates with someone and then sort of remove them from your life more safely, which means that what you're doing is you're lowering the cost associated with interacting with someone like a dark triad man, right? Now, I think almost all of the literature on dark triad and mating shows that dark triad men are a bit more desirable in general for short term than they are for long term. Generally, women actually do prefer a lot more, yeah, for within dark triad. But then, within, like, who would you prefer for a mate? It's a bit more mixed. Like, women tend to prefer non-dark triad men for long-term mates, which makes a lot of sense. And then for short term, it's a bit, the findings that I've seen are a bit more mixed, where like some prefer dark triad men, some prefer non-dark triad men. And the question is, why would you ever prefer a dark triad man for short-term dating? And I think that's what we were trying to answer with this. And I think one possibility, especially in modern situations, is that it's really easy for you to kind of learn about their deception and learn about the tactics they use and learn about the ways that they might fool you in a long-term relationship from the short-term relationship. And then you can have this like behavioral sort of repertoire that you can look out for when you're looking for a long-term mate.
So wait, can you say it again? Why would anyone ever be interested in mating with a dark triad individual?
So, well, first, how about we, so there was, I think, a nuance in the finding from this paper that maybe would help make sense of this too.
Thank you.
So there are two types of, or sort of two things that influence attraction. One of those is sort of it's kind of like with empathy. There's an affective attraction and there's a behavioral attraction. So what we found in this paper was that women, morbidly curious women or otherwise, were not really more affectively attracted to dark triad men. They didn't feel warm towards them, cozy towards them. But morbidly curious women were behaviorally attracted to dark triad men. They were very interested in them. They were interested in learning more about them. And how do you learn more about someone? Well, you go on a couple of dates with them and you can learn about someone pretty well, right? And why would you want to learn about a dark triad man? Well, one reason that you might want to do that is that it will help you spot them in the future, especially when you're looking for long-term mates. Because the whole point of a dark triad man's mating strategy is that they are being deceptive. They're not going to let you know that they're a dark triad man. So the only way that you can find out sort of their tricks is to actually play the game a little bit, right? To play the game, to kind of go through the motions, learn how they're being manipulative. And then you kind of can look out for that. You can spot that. And it doesn't mean that all of this is conscious, right? It doesn't mean that a woman is going into a short-term mating situation knowing that that's why she's doing this or even doing it intentionally for that reason. But I do think that that's a motivating factor, even if it's operating below the sort of conscious level of awareness.
So where does lust fit in? Is that within the... God, scientists are so nerdy. Behavioral... I mean, how unsexy are those terms?
Oh, you're right.
Do you know what I mean, doctor?
Yeah. I do, yeah. It's
behavioral attraction versus affective attraction. Where is it where you're just getting really turned on by someone? What bucket does that belong in?
It's got to be some like combination of both, right? Like you've got to feel a little warm towards them, but also, I mean, the behavioral attraction I think is probably closer to lust than affective attraction.
Because you guys didn't look at, you didn't look at the extent to which women are more sexually aroused by dark triad men, right? You didn't.
No, but has that paper? I feel like that's a paper that
P.K. Jonason has surely done that.
Surely that sounds like a study that's been done. Yeah. No, we didn't look at that, but yes, yeah.
if it's been done, he's done it.
Yeah, that fits within his purview perfectly.
I'm just curious, like what bucket that fits into.
Well, I think when you talk about arousal, you're talking about too. With if you watch a scary movie, your body gets aroused, right? Like you're
Yeah.
experiencing something dangerous in a safe setting, you're going to get aroused in a very similar way as you would if you were experiencing it in a dangerous setting. The difference is you kind of have the cognitive toolkit to tell you, I can pull myself out of this if I need to. I can get out of this if I need to. I'm not in true danger. And there could be something similar going on with dating a dark triad man, especially again in 2024. It's yes, are you at higher risk than if you weren't dating them? Yeah, you are. But is the risk tolerable for the amount of information and the type of information you might learn? Maybe, right? Especially if it's influenced by both interest and sort of this lust motivational sets, right? If it's influenced by both of those, it's going to push you towards a behavioral committing the behavior as opposed to avoiding it.
Yeah, good point. You've really got me thinking about a lot of things. Like, for instance, what is lust anyway? What is lust? There are studies showing that if you walk on a really wobbly bridge and you think you're going to die and your heart is racing,
Yeah.
if you see a female at the end of that bridge, you'll attribute that heart racing to being attracted to the female.
Yeah.
Forgetting
like you rate her
that
more
in fact-
attractive when you walk on the bridge than if you met her in the mall.
And that's a classic psychological study.
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder the extent to which sometimes some of these women are confusing lust for being
like thrilled by the
scared. I'm almost going to say scared.
Scared, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, actually. I hadn't made that connection, but that, especially with the bridge, the classic bridge study, I mean, that's exactly what they were looking at, right?
Yeah, I'm just like making connections between different areas of research,
Yeah. Well, if you ever want to do a study in a bar, let me know. That's the perfect one.
I would love to do that study. but I think we have to really be mindful of IRB and not actually scaring people and, all the caveats, the normal caveats. Yeah.
Well, that's, a lot of my research I do at haunted houses for that very reason, right? I can't scare people to the extent that you can out in.
Let's talk about that. Let's now talk about haunted houses, because I've been meaning to talk to you about that as well.
Sure.
And I really think this episode is going to be so interesting to so many people. I think that we're just having such an honest, explorative conversation about humans in a way that I just think that so many people are going to be so interested in this. So let's talk about haunted houses. I watched a really interesting documentary the other day about these extreme horror houses.
Oh, yeah.
It was the first time that they came on my radar. I was not aware they existed, and I was not aware there were a large number of women who are like, sign me up,
Yeah.
I was struck by the gender difference as well in this. There's a really creepy guy, in this Netflix documentary. I'm blanking on the name of this. It was supposedly the most well-known extreme horror house.
McCamey Manor, maybe.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. This really creepy guy. Like,
it's a bit creepy.
I mean, oh my gosh!
He's also like a wedding singer. Did they show that in the documentary?
No.
Oh my god, he sings at weddings too, which just makes it even creepier for some reason.
Oh my gosh, the things he did to these people, which they consented to, were really extreme. It was hard for me to watch, even me, who I like horror movies. But I guess this was because this was real. This is real footage,
and you can tell that he derives pleasure out of doing that. He's
he's a sadistic fuck.
He's sadistic. Yeah, he derives a lot of pleasure out of doing that, which is different from just enjoying like jump scaring your friends, right? Like if you, I think this guy seems like he like wants to torture people and can't legally do it, so he does this.
I think that's what it is. I think that's true. But then there's the other side. Let's talk about the other side.
Sure.
A lot of these individuals, and there were some men who went through it. It was so like adrenaline, and there was a feeling for them, I think maybe not so different than people who do extreme sports.
Sure.
That they overcame something. There was I got a sense that they felt a sense of mastery.
Oh yeah.
Through going through it. So is that another element we should bring into this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the only reason anyone goes to McCamey Manor. I don't think they go there for any other reason, right, than that feeling. They're
being tortured.
Yeah.
Voluntarily, consensually.
Yeah. And I can't remember at McCamey Manor. I mean, there are like haunted houses that you go to during Halloween, and then there's like on the far right tail of that, these extreme haunts. There was a famous one in LA. I think it was called Blackout. I don't know if it's still around. And then there's like McCamey Manor, where you basically consent to them to do whatever they want. Most of those have like a safe word or something you can use to still get out of it. I don't know if McCamey Manor does or not. I don't know. I've seen that documentary.
At least according to the documentary, he plays very fast and loose with that. He doesn't let you go until he decides.
Yeah, exactly.
And I really need to go. And that's problematic. To me, that's problematic.
To me too, especially for like a scary play situation. The whole point of the play is that you can end it when you're done, right? Otherwise, that's no longer play. That's something else.
It's something else. I mean, that's like straight up psychopath level shit there.
yeah. It's been a year or two since I've seen that documentary, but I remember even being shocked at that. I was thinking, and I was shocked too at the, there's a waiting list for people to get into that place.
Well, okay, so relating to our prior topic, not only a waiting list to get into it, he's got a waiting list of women who want to be his girlfriends.
He does? Yeah, I didn't know that.
Oh yes, I mean the documentary showed these beautiful young women just clamoring and fighting for his attention.
Huh? Maybe this is a different documentary than I've seen. I don't remember that part.
Yeah, I mean, the documentary you saw didn't showcase his exes.
No, but there've been a couple documentaries about McCamey Manor, so I probably watched an older one. But yeah, I guess I believe it in a weird way. Like I can kind of see that, right? I mean, serial killers get the same thing, even if they're not that attractive. I mean, like Ted Bundy's kind of the classic, charming, handsome serial killer, but there are a lot of less attractive. Like even Jeffrey Dahmer, who was gay, would get women writing him love letters in prison.
What is going on, doctor? Why? And then you have all these nice guys that feel like no one's interested in them.
Like, I haven't even been I'm not even a felon and I can't get anyone. Yeah. I think, as confusing as the women writing, and in the case of serial killers, this really is a subset of women as well. But
that's good.
In the case of that, I think at the same time that it's really confusing and weird, it kind of makes sense from this morbid curiosity framework, because what do you have if you have a serial killer who's in prison for life, let's say, or awaiting, execution? You have like arguably one of the most dangerous individuals you could ever personally meet, right? And you have them in a place where they can never harm you. That's like a perfect recipe for engaging in morbidly curious behavior, right? And in the case, I mean, that again, wanting to like marry them, that's maybe some other factors going into that. But I think like wanting to learn about them, being behaviorally interested in them, maybe writing them letters, getting to know them. I mean, that is the safest way to learn from the horse's mouth what a serial killer is like, right? There's no middleman there. There's not a documentary crew. It's just you writing the letter to the serial killer and him writing back. And so I think you just have this rare scenario where you have an incredibly dangerous individual who you can interact with, who can't hurt you in any kind of way.
I think a lot of this ties to Noel Carroll's theories about the paradox of horror. I'm sure that you have in your studies read his work.
Yeah, especially early in my studies. That was, early in grad school, I was reading his stuff. But what are you thinking though? Yeah,
I read in grad school. I would go to Paul Bloom's lab meetings, and we would discuss why horror is so popular. So big shout out to one of my mentors, Paul Bloom. But it just seems related. It is like, why are people so fascinated by horror? Well, the learning that it can bring us, and being able to reduce fear and anxiety about the world through knowledge and making sense, trying to make sense of things that don't make sense about people.
Yeah. And I think you don't only learn about the dangerous things, but you also learn about your own reactions to those dangerous things, right? Like you're learning about, if I'm watching a scary movie, let's say a true crime documentary or something, I'm learning about dangerous people, but I'm also learning about my own sort of responses to that and what it feels like to feel anxious and feel afraid. And, for better or worse, in our modern world, most people like living in the US don't have a lot of daily situations where they should feel incredibly anxious or incredibly afraid, right? And so we're not very familiar with those feelings, and we kind of push them away, which is not always bad, but it does mean that when they come up, they inevitably come up, right? We're not very good at dealing with them because we haven't experienced them and played with them and learned how to regulate those things. You have to experience bad emotions to learn how to regulate bad emotions. or negative
That's a great.
emotions.
That's a really great point. So another aspect of it is to increase resiliency and
I think
emotional
so.
regulation skills.
Yeah.
And that's consistent with this study. Why frightening imaginary worlds? The
Yeah.
morbid curiosity and the learning potential of horror. I mean, that's a paper. That's a paper I would direct people to. Maybe I can, in the show notes, add some of these studies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, that might be really valuable to our listeners. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Um,
that was a commentary to a paper about why people enjoy imaginary worlds in general. Right? A great, really great paper, fascinating paper about it was a BBS paper. Why do people enjoy imaginary worlds? And they put together this whole theoretical model about it. And one of the questions that I had when I read that paper was, well, why are there always? Yes, I think it is about openness and exploring new places. But why do these new fictional places almost inevitably have a bad guy? Almost always they have an evil, awful, terrible person living there doing terrible things to the good people who live there. And so that's what that commentary was about, was saying that, like, yes to all of this about why we love imaginary worlds, but one missing piece might be that we also love them because we can safely interact with and learn about villains, dangerous people who are going to cheat us or harm us or otherwise bad for our existence.
Makes a lot of sense. It's funny, your face was frozen there for a second with this look of expression, with your eyes wide open like this.
Why, like a fear face,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like
yeah. I'm gonna wait, do it again. Do it again. I want to take a screen capture. I think that'll be a good preview picture for this episode. Um, well, this links the way my mind works is my mind. I'm like an encyclopedia knowledge of the field of psychology, so I just go back and forth. No, I mean that's part of my autism. I'm able to always kind of just think of how this relates to that.
Yeah.
So it seems like a lot of this also relates to our understanding, Roy Baumeister's work on why is the bad so much more attention grabbing than the good.
Mm-hmm.
There's this particular paper that ties it all together called Choosing the Negative, a behavioral demonstration of morbid curiosity. So they found that social negative images were chosen more often than other negative categories. People deliberately subject themselves to negative images, and that's consistent with what you found in your 2021 study study 4.
Yeah. So that paper, that's a great paper, and it was the first. I would say that was the first modern paper on morbid curiosity. Was that choosing the behavioral, choosing the negative? That was probably the first. I think it was like a 2017 or 18 paper. So that paper used. Are you familiar with IAPS, the International Affective Picture System? I think is what that stands for.
I'm not.
So it's a collection of images that have been pre-rated for valence and arousal and different emotions, basically. Okay. And so there's ones that are negative or positive or high arousal, low arousal. And what that paper and a lot of psychology studies use IAPS. I actually have a huge problem with IAPS. I think it's like one of the most ecologically invalid things you could use, but it does its job in that it's a very standardized set of images that you can use to reliably, see differences between images. So that paper, used the IAPS image set of pre-rated images for like social negative images or positive social images or negative non-social or positive non-social or neutral. And basically found that people prefer, when given the choice, to look at a negative image, and in particular a negative social image, which makes a lot of sense because we have sort of this negativity or threat bias, and we also have a social bias where we pay attention to social information. So if you give people just the choice to look at these two images, they're going to choose the one that's negative because it's potentially more important information, and the one that's social because it's potentially more important information.
But there's something really deep going on here about the wiring of the human brain, which is suggested by this 2020 study by Suzanne Oosterwich et al., finding that choosing intensely negative stimuli engages similar brain regions as those that support extrinsic incentives and regular curiosity, such as the striatum, inferior frontal gyrus, anterior insula, and anterior cingulate cortex. So could it be that we're like wired as humans to find negative information more rewarding than positive information? That's my question for you.
I would say, yeah.
Holy, holy cow.
Well, I mean, rewarding from like from a like neurobiological perspective,
Oh yeah,
rewarding. Yeah, I would say
and
so. I would say that Suzanne she showed that in that paper,
she
right? I
showed
think.
that.
Yeah, but yeah, I would say that seems consistent with anything that I've ever found, or in my papers. I mean, that's I think that's the proximate explanation for why we do it. It's a proximate explanation is that it's more rewarding from a neurochemical perspective.
And from an evolutionary psychology perspective, as these researchers argue in the paper, interested in serial killers, morbid curiosity in college students, it's a lot about protective vigilance.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be a big, you could imagine on the savannah. If you have the one serial killer in the clan, like you want to find that one. You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, and I actually, and you bring up the savannah. Actually, a lot of my thinking as I've done my research over the years, a lot of my thinking ties back to animals because I did a behavioral biology degree, and my advisor he studied monkeys, right? So I was kind of just always in this like, well, what do other animals do mindset? So are other animals morbidly curious was one of the questions that I asked myself as I was doing this research. And I think the answer is yes. They have fewer opportunities to exercise that, but when given the opportunity, they do seem to be morbidly curious. So like on the savannah, for example, Thompson's gazelles will observe their natural predators as opposed to just running from them, right? So like if you've got, or let's take like lions and zebras, for example, because you can probably find photos of this online. If you have a group of zebras who are grazing and a lion is off in the distance, you might imagine like, oh, well, if a zebra sees that lion, all the zebras are going to run away because why would they not? That's what zebras do when they see a lion. But that's actually not what zebras do when they see a lion. It's not what a gazelle does when they see a cheetah. What they do, depending on how far away the predator is and how big of a group they're in and some other factors, is they actually observe the predator. It's got its own name. It's called predator inspection. And presumably they're observing the predator because they're trying to learn about the predator. What does it look like? What are its movements like? Does it look like it's hunting? Does it look like it's relaxing? They're vigilant towards the predator, right? I think humans do the same thing. The only difference is, and it's a big difference, but the only difference is we can create completely safe scenarios with stories where we can engage in predator inspection, right? So that means that we can exercise our morbid curiosity almost infinitely. Whereas, for a gazelle, it's got the cheetah's got to be, at least 30 yards away. It gets closer, it gets a little too dangerous. It's got to run. They can't go back to Gazelle Town and tell stories about cheetahs. They have to just observe firsthand what the cheetah looks like and learn about it that way. Humans can create a million different documentaries and books and movies and TV shows and other kinds of stories about dangerous situations or dangerous predators or individuals and learn about them that way. And not only that, but learn about them in situations that have never existed or haven't existed yet, but are likely to exist. This is exactly why we like apocalyptic movies, right? The apocalypse has not happened yet. Many small apocalypses have happened around the world to different groups. But one big one hasn't happened. But what can we do? Well, we can tell a story about what might happen and we can learn about that. And we can maybe learn how to prevent that. We can learn how to take steps to prevent that. We can learn about or imagine ourselves in that situation and ask ourselves, what would we do in that situation, right? That's like most of what morbid curiosity is what do they do and what would we do?
Yeah. Wow. This is all really coming together so nicely and in a way where we're really starting to understand the systems involved here and how being interested in and fascinated by these things is really a separate system than being the perpetrator of these things.
Correct.
I mean, I think that's a thread actually running through this whole episode.
Yeah.
So kind of just tying it all together, I think that's a good kind of place to end for people so they can kind of see the arc of this episode and how we synthesized a good number of studies. There's more we could talk about, of course, like conspiracy theories and COVID fascination. Look, I read all the studies, in preparation for this, and I think it's such a cool body of literature that really explains a lot about humans.
And something that's been missing, right? Something psychology kind of just overlooked in some ways for so long.
Agreed. And it tells us a lot about humans as well as certain humans, and
Yeah.
and why certain humans are not fascinated by that. It's I would say, because I love horror movies, I would say on dating apps it's hard for me to find women who love horror movies and who are also compassionate, loving women, which is my type
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
So being able to find that combination is like a unicorn for me. So if you're listening to this podcast and you like horror movies and you're a good person, hit me up on Instagram. But all joking aside, Colton, it is so nice to have this chat with you, and I'm glad I could shine a spotlight on your very seminal work in the field.
Yeah, thank you. It's been one of the more, I've done lots of podcasts. This has been probably one of the most interesting conversations.
Wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. Definitely, sure it was nerdy. One of the most nerdy.
Definitely the nerdiest.